Hey, it's the Constant Crafter. Thanks for joining me for part 2. If you didn't see part 1, we created our quilt top. But this is part 2. This is where we're going to layer our quilt, we're going to sew it, we're going to flip it, and then we're going to quilt and finish it off. Lay out our batting first. Make sure that it is super straight and neat. And then this is our minky fabric that I showed you in part 1, and you can see that one side, the circles push in, and one side is so much softer and the circles push out. You are going to lay your backing fabric face up. Smooth it out. Make sure that that batting underneath is smoothed out. Lay out the top layer of your quilt. That's what we did in part 1, face down. And now we're going to baste our quilt with pins. So you're pinning through all 3 fabrics to keep them together as you sew. And you don't have to do every single box if you don't want to. I think I did every other box, and I did a lot of pins around the edges. Cut the excess fabric off and take it to our sewing machine. It is time for the obligatory sewing clip. Sew around the perimeter of your quilt, leaving 6 inches open at the bottom, and that's where we'll flip our quilt, like when we make a pillow. After review of the play, we have decided to cut off the last set of boxes on our quilt. Later in this video, I will show you how to close the bottom of your quilt. Where does this leave us? Well, you can leave that 6-inch opening in the bottom, and you can close it with a ladder or an invisible stitch. I'll be sure to make a video on this stitch in one of my next videos. That's all for the football violation. Let's get back to our quilt. If you are new to sewing and you really want to try a quilt, I'm going to show you what to do when you get to the corner. Put the needle in our fabric, lift up the feet, turn your fabric 90 degrees, put the feet down, and continue sewing to the next corner. I also have a beginner sewing tutorial, how to make a pillow video. That's a great starting video if you're just getting into sewing. All right, to give our quilt some movement, we're going to snip the fabric all the way around, but be very careful not to snip the stitch. Not to switch. Be very careful not to snip the switch. But be very careful not to snip the stitch. So you're going to snip right up to the stitch. So do that all the way around. And now we flip. You're going to make sure that you put your hand in between the top layer and the bottom layer. It's looking magical. Take your pencil or your dowel and gently poke out the corners. After you flip it inside out, you're going to baste the quilt again with the pins. This will keep the 3 layers of fabric together as you finish quilting. Roll up your fabrics on either end, and we're going to stitch in that center ditch all the way across. This method is going to keep all your layers of fabric together. This is not the only method. Some people have a quilting machine and they do little designs on each square, but I like the simplicity, just looking at the quilting squares on the front and having the stitches on the back. And then go to the next line. Instead of stitching up and down my quilt, I thought it would be easier to stitch across my quilt. This works for me, it works for my kids, and this is how I make a simple quilt. After you do the boxes across the one direction, you can turn your quilt and you can absolutely do it the other direction. This is the bottom of my quilt, and now I'm going to cut the batting just a 1/2 inch so that I have room to bind it. I finish my quilt by folding up the top layer over the back fabric of the quilt. Be sure to fold it twice so the raw edges are hidden underneath. So I'm folding it up and I'm folding it under. This is not the only technique to bind a quilt, but this was the way that I decided to finish my quilt off. Bring it up, fold it under, and pin and sew. I am working on the floor, so I am like almost sewing one-handed here. And if it's not making sense to you, there's another look right here. So you can see as I sew, it's coming apart just a tiny bit. So I'm gonna fold it over and fold it under. So the raw edges are hidden in that seam. And now I'm gonna sew over it and they will be tucked underneath. You can also fold it up and give it an iron and make it really neat. I think I was a little bit anxious to finish this project. My daughter had been waiting a couple weeks for it, so she was ready. Do it all the way across and you have yourself a quilt.
I'm Princess Quilt. I love it. Thank you, Mama.
And it is folded under on the sides. It is not tucked in. Thank you for joining me for part 2. I hope that this gave you confidence to make your own simple quilt. I'm the Constant Crafter and I'm really active on TikTok and YouTube, so leave me a comment and I would love to connect with you there. Happy quilting!